The crystal chandelier above table 4 cost more than the average American home, but the men sitting beneath it were about to lose $4 billion. Sarah stood perfectly still in the shadows, a silver serving tray balanced on her left palm, listening to the most feared private equity titan on Wall Street berate his executive team. He was ruthless, cornered, and looking for blood. When his cold gaze snapped away from his trembling CFO and locked on to Sarah, he didn't see a former Wharton prodigy hiding from a mountain of medical debt. He just saw a girl in a cheap apron. With a cruel, mocking smirk, he threw his impossible corporate dilemma at her, expecting a stuttering apology. Instead, she destroyed his entire firm's valuation model in 3 sentences. The silence that followed was deafening. The air inside the Sovereign, Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, always smelled faintly of white truffles, scorched rosemary, and quiet desperation. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary for the elite, a 3 Michelin-star fortress where a Wagyu ribeye cost what a schoolteacher made in a week. But to Sarah Jenkins, it was an 8-hour treadmill of burning calves, fake smiles, and the biting sting of invisible humiliation. Sarah adjusted the stiff, white collar of her uniform and wiped a bead of sweat from her temple. She was 26 years old, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and an unhealthy amount of black coffee. Just 3 years ago, she had been sitting in the front row of a corporate finance lecture at Wharton, dissecting leveraged buyouts and mezzanine debt. She had summered at Goldman Sachs. She was supposed to be the youngest junior partner at McKinsey by 30. Life, however, rarely consults your 5-year plan. When her father, a middle-class hardware store owner in Ohio, suffered a massive stroke followed by a cascade of neurological complications, the insurance companies did what they do best. They found a loophole. The medical bills didn't just drain her parents' retirement. They devoured the house, the savings, and the college fund. Sarah hadn't just dropped out of the Ivy League. She had plummeted into the brutal reality of the working class, moving to New York not to conquer Wall Street, but to send every spare dollar of her tip money to an aggressively relentless medical debt collection agency. Table 4 needs their wine poured, Sarah. Move. Now, hissed Thomas, the restaurant's impeccably groomed and perpetually stressed maitre d'. He snapped his fingers an inch from her face. And for God's sake, don't make eye contact with him. Him was William Hastings. William Hastings wasn't just wealthy, he was market-moving wealthy. As the founder and CEO of Hastings Capital, a ruthless private equity firm managing over $80 billion in assets, he was a predator in a bespoke Brioni suit. He was known for buying struggling legacy companies, stripping them down to the copper wiring, firing thousands, and selling the husks for an obscene profit. He was brilliant, terrifying, and completely devoid of empathy. Tonight, he had rented out the private alcove of the Sovereign to host an emergency dinner with his top executives. Sarah picked up the chilled bottle of Dom Perignon, her hand steady despite the exhaustion radiating through her spine. She knew the golden rule of high-end hospitality. Be a ghost. Anticipate the need, pour the water, clear the bone china, and never, ever speak unless spoken to. As she slipped past the heavy velvet curtains and entered the private alcove, the tension in the room hit her like a physical wave. There were 4 people at the table. Hastings sat at the head, swirling a glass of sparkling water, his silver hair catching the dim light. To his right was his chief financial officer, a balding, sweat-drenched man named David, who looked like he was about to hyperventilate. Across from David sat Chloe and Peter, 2 razor-sharp vice presidents of mergers and acquisitions who were currently staring at their iPads as if the screens held the cure to a terminal illness. I don't pay you people 7-figure bonuses to tell me you don't know. Hastings's voice was dangerously low, a serrated whisper that cut through the soft jazz playing overhead. Sarah approached silently, stepping up to David's right side to refill his wine glass. Her movements were fluid, practiced, and entirely ignored by the billionaires at the table. "William, the numbers simply do not reconcile," David stammered, frantically wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. "We've had the quants run the Monte Carlo simulations 3 times. We've had the forensic accounting team from Deloitte look at the ledgers. Horizon Logistics is reporting record shipping volumes. The global supply chain is strained. Demand is through the roof. Their ships are running at maximum capacity. And yet they are bleeding cash like a stuck pig," Hastings interrupted, slamming his hand flat on the table. The crystal glasses jumped. Sarah didn't flinch. She seamlessly moved to Chloe's glass, pouring the champagne with a perfectly steady hand. Sarah's ears pricked up. Horizon Logistics. She recognized the name immediately. Everyone who read the Financial Times did. It was an 80-year-old shipping conglomerate currently in the middle of a massive downward spiral. Their stock price had halved in the last 6 months. Their EBITDA is down 40% year over year, Peter chimed in, his voice tight. Operating expenses are skyrocketing. It makes no sense, William. Fuel prices are locked in with long-term hedges. Labor costs haven't increased, and they haven't purchased new vessels. But every quarter, millions of dollars are vanishing into their administrative and operational line items. If we execute this hostile takeover tomorrow, we might be buying a company with a fatal, hidden liability. We can't find the leak. Then look harder, Hastings roared. The board meets at 8 a.m. tomorrow. We either launch the proxy fight and buy this rotting carcass, or we walk away and let Vanguard swoop in. There is a $4 billion arbitrage opportunity here. Horizon's assets, the ships, the ports, are worth double their market cap. But I am not signing a check until I know why they are hemorrhaging cash. Sarah moved to Hastings' side. As she reached over to clear his salad plate, her mind was racing. Record volume, flat fuel costs, skyrocketing operational expenses. It was a puzzle, a beautiful, complex mathematical puzzle, the exact kind she used to solve at 2 a.m. in the Wharton Library just for fun. She pictured the balance sheet in her head. If a massive, asset-heavy company was suddenly losing cash without buying new assets or paying more for operations, the money was being deliberately hidden. It was an artificial burn. Wait, Sarah thought, her breath catching slightly as she lifted the plate. They aren't losing the money. They are hiding it to avoid exactly what Hastings is trying to do. It's a poison pill, David argued, echoing her thoughts. They know we're circling. They're sabotaging their own earnings to make the company look unappealing. I know it's a defensive maneuver, David, Hastings snarled, leaning forward. But how are they doing it? You can't just burn $50 million a quarter and hide it from the SEC. Where is the cash going? If we don't know the mechanism, we can't reverse it once we take over. The room fell completely silent. The 3 executives stared down at their plates, utterly defeated. The greatest financial minds in the city, paralyzed by a balance sheet. Sarah stood just behind Hastings's chair. The tray was heavy. Her shift was supposed to end in 20 minutes. She should have turned around, walked back through the velvet curtains, and gone back to her quiet, invisible life. But as she looked at the iPad screen resting on the table near Hastings' elbow, displaying Horizon Logistics public filings, a glaring anomaly caught her eye. It was buried in the footnotes of a subsidiary's lease agreements, an elegant, almost invisible accounting trick. She let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. It was a mistake. Hastings whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto Sarah. "Did you just sigh at me?" he demanded. The three executives froze. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Hastings was a man who fired senior partners for making the wrong facial expressions during meetings. A waitress reacting to his outburst was an unthinkable breach of reality. Sarah kept her posture perfect, clutching the silver tray. "No, sir, I apologize. I was simply clearing the table." Hastings stared at her. His eyes were cold, assessing, and brimming with unspent anger. He was frustrated, and she had just presented herself as a convenient target. "No, I heard it." "You sighed," Hastings said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. He looked her up and down, taking in the cheap uniform, the tied-back hair, the tired eyes. A cruel, condescending smile spread across his face. He turned to his executives. "Well, team, since my Ivy League geniuses, who I pay millions of dollars a year, can't figure out a basic accounting puzzle, maybe we should ask the help." David winced. "William, please, let's just focus on the—" "Shut up, David," Hastings snapped, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sarah, sir." "Sarah," Hastings repeated, drawing the word out mockingly. "Tell me, Sarah, you pour a very nice glass of champagne. Do you also happen to know anything about corporate takeovers? Do you dabble in distressed asset valuation between clearing the soup bowls?" A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the alcove. Chloe looked away, visibly uncomfortable with the billionaire's sadistic bullying. Peter stared at the tablecloth. They all knew what this was. Hastings was using her to humiliate them. "Sir, I should get back to the kitchen," Sarah said evenly, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline suddenly flooding her veins. "I'm paying $10,000 just to rent this room," Hastings said softly, the threat clear in his tone. "You aren't going anywhere until you answer the question. I want your expert, waitressing opinion. Horizon Logistics has 80 massive cargo ships. They have more business than they can handle. But every month, they report massive operational losses. Where is the money going? Come on, Sarah, earn your tip." The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Sarah looked at Hastings. She looked at his expensive suit, his smug face, his absolute certainty that she was nothing more than an uneducated servant placed on earth to bring him food. For 3 years, she had swallowed her pride. She had let customers snap at her, managers belittle her, and the world walk all over her so she could pay for her mother's dialysis and her father's care. But right now, looking into William Hastings's arrogant eyes, the ghost of the Wharton prodigy woke up. "Screw it," she thought. Sarah didn't stutter. She didn't look down. She slowly lowered the silver serving tray onto a side stand, turning her full attention to the billionaire. "They aren't losing the money, Mr. Hastings," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't quiet anymore. It was sharp, clear, and projected with the confidence of a lead consultant in a boardroom. "They are leasing their own property back to themselves through a synthetic sale-leaseback structure via offshore shell entities." The smirk on Hastings's face froze. David, the CFO, slowly looked up from his hands, his eyes widening. "Excuse me," Hastings said, the mockery vanishing, replaced by genuine shock. Sarah took a step closer to the table, her eyes locked onto Hastings. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was holding court. "You're looking at their operational expenses, specifically line items related to vessel chartering and maintenance, correct?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the iPad. "You mentioned they haven't bought any new vessels, but you didn't check if they still own the ones they already had." Peter practically lunged for his iPad, frantically tapping the screen. "Horizon's CEO is employing a scorched earth defense," Sarah continued, her mind firing on all cylinders, the numbers clicking perfectly into place. 6 months ago, Right when your fund started quietly buying up their stock, Horizon quietly transferred the titles of their 30 largest cargo vessels to a series of variable interest entities, shell companies, registered in the Marshall Islands. Then, Horizon signed 10-year, ironclad contracts to lease those exact same ships back from the shell companies at 3 times the market rate. The executives were staring at her in stunned silence. The only sound in the room was the soft clinking of silverware from the main dining room outside the curtains. That's why their revenue is high, but their cash is disappearing, Sarah explained, her tone almost conversational now, dissecting the billion-dollar company like a high school biology frog. They are artificially inflating their operational expenses by paying exorbitant lease fees to themselves. The money isn't gone. It's sitting in offshore bank accounts controlled by the board of directors. If you execute a hostile takeover, you don't get the ships. You get a company legally obligated to pay billions of dollars in toxic lease agreements for the next decade. The moment you buy them, they trigger a change of control clause. The shell companies liquidate, and the board members walk away with the cash, leaving you holding a bankrupt husk. David's face had drained of all color. He looked at Peter. Pull up the Q2 subsidiary filings, the unconsolidated entities. Peter's fingers flew across the screen. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The sweat on David's forehead was no longer from heat, it was from terror. "Oh my God," Peter whispered. "Is it there?" Hastings demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. It's hidden under a master bareboat charter agreement," Peter stammered, his eyes glued to the screen. 30 vessels, transferred to a holding company called Azure Deep LLC in Majuro. The leaseback rates they're astronomical. 200% above market average. Chloe looked at Sarah as if she had just witnessed a miracle. "How did we miss this?" she breathed. "Because you were looking for a leak, not a siphon," Sarah said simply. "You sent forensic accountants to look for fraud. It isn't fraud. It's a perfectly legal, heavily obfuscated corporate restructuring designed specifically to trick an aggressive private equity firm into overvaluing the target." Hastings didn't look at his executives. He didn't look at the iPad. He just stared at the waitress standing before him. The arrogant, predatory gleam in his eyes had been completely replaced by something else, an intense, burning curiosity. A hostile takeover would have triggered the poison pill, Hastings murmured to himself. He looked up at Sarah. "If I had bought that company tomorrow morning, I would have lost $4 billion. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "You would have." She reached over, picked up her silver serving tray, and balanced it back on her left palm. The spell was broken. She was just an employee again. "If there is nothing else, gentlemen, I will bring the dessert menus." Sarah turned and walked out of the alcove, slipping through the velvet curtains without looking back. She left behind 4 of the most powerful people on Wall Street, sitting in absolute, stunned silence. As the heavy curtains closed behind her, Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She marched straight through the bustling kitchen, ignoring the shouts of the line cooks, and pushed through the swinging doors into the back alley. The cold Manhattan air hit her face. She leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes, waiting for the adrenaline crash. She had just shown up the most powerful man in finance. She was probably going to be fired the second the manager found out. She spoke out of turn to a VIP guest. 5 minutes later, the heavy metal door to the alley squeaked open. Sarah braced herself, expecting Thomas to come out screaming, demanding her apron. But it wasn't Thomas. Standing in the alleyway, illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp, was William Hastings. He wasn't flanked by his executives or his security detail. He stood alone, his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, staring at her with an unreadable expression. "Who the hell are you?" Hastings asked. The alley behind the Sovereign smelled of damp cardboard, stale grease, and the sharp ozone of a looming Manhattan thunderstorm. Sarah stood frozen, the cold brick wall biting through her thin white blouse. William Hastings, a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small European nations, was looking at her not as a servant, but as an anomaly. And William Hastings did not like anomalies. "I asked you a question," Hastings said, his voice stripped of the theatrical cruelty he had used inside. It was flat, analytical, and demanding. "Who are you?" Sarah swallowed hard. The adrenaline was ebbing, leaving behind a cold, hard exhaustion. She didn't have the energy to lie, nor the desire to play games with a billionaire. "Sarah Jenkins," she said, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the chill. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Hastings. My shift ended 10 minutes ago." Hastings took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes stepping carelessly into a shallow puddle. "You didn't learn synthetic sale leaseback structuring by serving foie gras, Sarah Jenkins. That was a Tier 1 forensic analysis. You dismantled a $4 billion trap in under 2 minutes based on a glance at an iPad. My CFO, who holds 2 degrees from Harvard, missed it for 3 weeks." "Then you should fire your CFO," Sarah replied. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Hastings let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was a startling sound in the grim alleyway. "Oh, I probably will. But that doesn't answer my question. Where did you learn to read a balance sheet like that?" "Wharton," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Saying the name out loud felt like touching an open wound. "Undergraduate, summa cum laude track. I was recruited by Goldman Sachs for their distressed debt desk." Hastings tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as his mind rapidly processed the data. "Past tense. You didn't take the offer. Why?" "Life happened, Mr. Hastings." Sarah looked away, staring at the flickering neon sign of a bodega down the street. "My father had a severe stroke. The insurance company fought every claim. The out-of-pocket costs at Mount Sinai for the surgeries, the rehabilitation, the specialized care. It wiped us out. The debt collectors started putting liens on our property. I had to drop out in my final semester to work." "So you serve champagne to people like me," Hastings summarized, devoid of pity. He wasn't a man who trafficked in emotion, he trafficked in leverage. "It pays the bills." "Barely." Hastings reached into the breast pocket of his Brioni suit, pulling out a sleek, matte black business card. He held it out between his index and middle fingers. Sarah stared at it, but didn't move her hands. "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. sharp." "My office," Hastings commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. 57th and Madison, the penthouse level. "I have a double shift here tomorrow," Sarah protested, though her heart was beginning to hammer against her ribs all over again. "No, you don't," Hastings said. He dropped the card on the silver serving tray she had left, balanced on a nearby stack of empty milk crates. "Because if you walk back into that restaurant, you will be a waitress for the rest of your life. If you walk into my office at 6 a.m., I will give you a chance to prove that what happened tonight wasn't a fluke. If it was, I'll validate your parking, and you can come back here and beg for your apron. If it wasn't, we will talk." Before Sarah could respond, Hastings turned on his heel. He walked down the alley, a sleek black Maybach, pulling up to the curb the moment his foot hit the pavement. He got in, and the car silently glided away into the New York night. Sarah stood alone in the dark. She looked down at the matte black card. It had no title, no email address, just a name and a phone number embossed in silver. William Hastings. The next morning, the sun had barely breached the horizon when Sarah stepped off the subway. She was wearing her only professional outfit, a charcoal grey skirt suit she had bought from a thrift store and painstakingly tailored herself, paired with scuffed black pumps. She felt like an imposter. The headquarters of Hastings Capital was a temple of modern finance, polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling blast-proof glass, and an army of security guards who looked like former Navy SEALs. When she approached the front desk, the intimidating receptionist barely glanced at her. "Sarah Jenkins," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here to see William Hastings." The receptionist finally looked up, raising an impeccably plucked eyebrow. "Mr. Hastings does not take She stopped. She looked at her computer screen, her eyes widening slightly. "My apologies, Miss Jenkins. Executive elevator, top floor. He is expecting you." When the brushed steel doors parted on the penthouse level, Sarah stepped into a different world. The air was silent, heavy with money and power. Rows of junior analysts were already hunched over glowing Bloomberg terminals, their faces pale in the blue light. David, the CFO she had humiliated the night before, was waiting by the elevator banks. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He glared at Sarah with a mixture of intense resentment and deep, underlying fear. "Follow me," David snapped, turning on his heel. He led her past the bullpen and into a massive, glass-walled conference room overlooking Central Park. Inside, the table was covered in towering stacks of physical manila folders, financial prospectuses, and raw data printouts. Hastings was standing by the window, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Right on time," Hastings said, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "Good." "What is this?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the mountain of paperwork. Hastings finally turned, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory gleam. "This, Sarah, is a crucible. KKR and Apollo are both circling a massive industrial manufacturing conglomerate based in Ohio. Sterling Dynamics. They make everything from ball bearings for aerospace contractors to heavy machinery for agriculture. On paper, it is the perfect acquisition. Solid cash flow, incredible market share, undervalued assets." He walked over to the table and slammed his hand down on a stack of files. "My team has been running the numbers for 3 weeks. They say we should bid $5 billion. I don't believe them." David flushed red. "William, the quantitative models are flawless. We ran the regressions." "The models only tell you what the data wants you to see, David," Hastings barked, silencing the CFO instantly. He turned his gaze back to Sarah. "I don't trust perfect numbers. Perfect numbers mean someone is hiding something ugly. You found the trap in Horizon Logistics. I want to know if you can do it again." Sarah looked at the thousands of pages of raw data. "You want me to audit a $5 billion company?" "I want you to find the rot," Hastings corrected. "You have 48 hours. You will not leave this room. We will bring you food. We will bring you coffee. You have full access to our databases. If you find the flaw that makes this deal a nightmare, I will solve your medical debt problem today. If you fail, you walk out of here and never speak my name again." He didn't wait for her to agree. Hastings walked out of the room, David trailing behind him like a beaten dog. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving Sarah entirely alone with a billion-dollar puzzle. The first 12 hours were a blur of caffeine and spreadsheets. Sarah stripped off her thrift store blazer, rolled up her sleeves, and dove into the financial guts of Sterling Dynamics. It was a brutal, grueling process. The company had over 50 subsidiaries spread across the Midwest. The ledgers were a labyrinth of intercompany transfers, depreciating assets, and complex tax deferrals. By 2 a.m., the glass walls of the conference room reflected a ghostly image of Sarah, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her eyes burning as she scrolled through endless rows of supply chain invoices. Hastings was right. The numbers were too clean. Every quarterly report showed steady, unbreakable growth. The profit margins on their heavy machinery division were consistently outperforming the industry average by almost 20%. David's team had attributed this to superior operational efficiency. But Sarah knew that in heavy manufacturing, operational efficiency didn't just magically appear out of thin air. You either paid less for materials, paid less for labor, or you cut corners somewhere dark. She began cross-referencing Sterling Dynamics labor contracts, union wages, fixed costs. No anomalies there. She checked their raw material suppliers, standard market rates for steel, aluminum, and copper. If it's not the input and it's not the labor, it has to be the output, Sarah thought, rubbing her temples. Or the byproduct. At 8 a.m. on the second day, Chloe, the sharp-dressed VP from the restaurant, walked in carrying a tray with a bagel and a fresh espresso. She looked at the chaotic web of sticky notes Sarah had plastered across the glass walls. "You look like a serial killer's basement," Chloe noted dryly, setting the tray down. "Thank you," Sarah mumbled, not taking her eyes off the screen. Chloe lingered for a moment. "You know he's setting you up to fail, right? Hastings doesn't believe in Cinderella stories. He thinks you got lucky with the shipping company. He gave you this assignment because it's airtight. He wants to break your confidence so he can sleep at night knowing a waitress didn't outsmart him." "We'll see," Sarah replied, taking a bite of the dry bagel. By hour 36, the exhaustion was causing microscopic hallucinations at the edges of her vision, but the adrenaline of the hunt kept her fingers flying across the keyboard. She had abandoned the high-level executive summaries and was digging into the granular, miserable details: municipal tax records, localized utility bills, and hazardous waste disposal manifests for Sterling's oldest manufacturing plant in Canton, Ohio. That's when she found it. It wasn't a missing zero. It wasn't a hidden offshore account. It was a complete absence of data. Sarah pulled up the EPA regulatory filings for the Canton plant. For the last 40 years, Sterling Dynamics had used a highly toxic chemical solvent, trichloroethylene, TCE, to degrease heavy machinery parts. The disposal of TCE is heavily regulated, extremely expensive, and requires a massive paper trail. According to the ledgers from 1980 to 2015, Sterling spent millions annually on specialized hazardous waste removal companies to haul the toxic sludge away. But in 2016, that line item vanished entirely. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled up the production logs. Production hadn't slowed down. It had increased. They were still using thousands of gallons of the chemical, but they weren't paying anyone to dispose of it. Where did it go? Frantically, she cross-referenced the property deeds for the Canton facility. In 2016, Sterling had purchased a massive 300-acre plot of completely barren, unusable swampland directly adjacent to their factory. They had registered it under a dummy LLC meant for future expansion. But no buildings were ever built. Sarah's stomach churned with a sickening realization. They weren't paying to dispose of the toxic waste anymore. They were pumping it directly into the ground on their own dummy property. They were poisoning the groundwater of an entire Ohio county to save $40 million a year in disposal fees. That was their superior operational efficiency. If Hastings Capital bought the company, the moment the EPA discovered the illegal dumping site, Hastings would be on the hook for a multi-billion-dollar federal cleanup mandate criminal liability and a catastrophic public relations nightmare. The $5 billion acquisition would turn into a $10 billion grave. At exactly 5:55 a.m. on the second day, the heavy glass doors swung open. William Hastings walked in, looking perfectly rested in a crisp navy suit. David trailed behind him, holding a thick binder, looking incredibly smug. "Time is up, Ms. Jenkins," Hastings said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Tell me you found a reason not to buy this gold mine." Sarah slowly stood up. Her legs felt like lead, and her cheap thrift store suit was hopelessly wrinkled, but her eyes were ablaze with a terrifying clarity. "You can't buy Sterling Dynamics," Sarah stated, her voice raspy from disuse. David scoffed loudly. "William, this is ridiculous. We are prepared to make the offer at market open." "Shut up, David," Hastings ordered softly. He walked over to the table and leaned against it, staring at Sarah. "Enlighten me." Sarah didn't look at her notes. The numbers were burned into her retinas. In 2016, Sterling Dynamics achieved a massive bump in their EBITDA margins. Your team attributed it to new management efficiencies. They were wrong. It was achieved by committing federal environmental crimes on an industrial scale. David's smug expression instantly evaporated. "What are you talking about?" "TCE disposal," Sarah fired back, pointing a shaking finger at the CFO. "They use hundreds of thousands of gallons of chemical degreasers, but for the last 8 years, there are 0 invoices for hazardous waste removal. None. 0. They bought 300 acres of swampland next to their primary facility in Ohio under a blind trust. They are dumping toxic sludge directly into the aquifer. It's a Superfund site waiting to detonate." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the exact same silence that had fallen over the private dining room at the Sovereign. David began to stammer, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his binder. That can't be right." The environmental auditors signed off on the Phase 1 assessments. The auditors looked at the primary property lines, Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "They didn't look at the adjacent LLC because it was legally walled off, but the liability pierces the corporate veil the second you acquire the parent company. If you buy Sterling, you are buying a federal indictment." Hastings didn't move. He didn't yell. He simply looked down at the floor, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a great white shark that had finally found deep water. He looked up at David. "David," Hastings whispered. "William, I swear, the due diligence team—" "You are fired," Hastings said. The words were simple, cold, and utterly final. "Leave your keycard on the desk. Security will escort you out of the building. You have 10 minutes to clear your office." David looked as though he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth to argue, saw the absolute murder in Hastings' eyes, and wisely snapped his mouth shut. He dropped his binder on the floor and practically ran out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Hastings finally pushed himself off the table. He slowly walked over to Sarah, stopping mere inches away from her. "I knew about the chemical dumping," Hastings said quietly. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. You knew?" "I have private investigators in Canton," Hastings said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I knew what they were doing 3 weeks ago. I knew it was a poisoned well." Sarah felt a flash of hot, blinding anger cut through her exhaustion. "Then why did you make me spend 48 hours staring at spreadsheets? Why put me through this?" "Because," Hastings said, leaning in, his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, burning respect. "I needed to know if you would find it. And more importantly, I needed to know if you would have the spine to look me in the eye and tell me my $1 billion deal was garbage. Most analysts would have rubber-stamped it just to please me. You didn't? Hastings reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen and a single piece of heavy stock paper. He slid it across the glass table toward her. It was an employment contract. Your father's medical debt will be paid in full by noon today, Hastings stated, his tone shifting from adversary to commanding officer. You are no longer a waitress. You are a senior director of acquisitions at Hastings Capital. Your starting base salary is $2 million a year, with a 5% cut of the carried interest on any deal you save me from. You will report directly and exclusively to me. Sarah stared at the paper. The number written on it was impossible. It was salvation. It was the end of the nightmares, the end of the collection calls, the end of watching her mother cry over hospital bills. But as she looked up into William Hastings' cold, predatory eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't saving her. He was buying a weapon. Do we have a deal, Sarah? 6 months into her tenure at Hastings Capital, Sarah Jenkins had learned one undeniable truth about Wall Street. The men in the bespoke suits were far more vicious than the debt collectors who used to harass her family. The transition from the floor of the Sovereign to the penthouse of a premier private equity firm had been violent. The morning she signed her employment contract, William Hastings personally wired $840,000 to the collection agencies holding her father's medical debt. Within an hour, the liens on her parents' Ohio home were dissolved. When Sarah called her mother to tell her the news, she had locked herself in a bathroom stall on the 50th floor, biting down on her knuckles to muffle her own sobbing. But there was no time for gratitude. Hastings had not bought her loyalty. He had purchased her mind, and he expected a return on his investment. Sarah's new office was a sprawling expanse of mahogany and glass overlooking the Chrysler Building. It was a beautiful cage. The existing partners and vice presidents despised her. They were men who had bled for years at Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, men who had pedigrees from Princeton and Yale. To them, Sarah was an offensive anomaly, a waitress who had inexplicably bewitched the CEO. They whispered about her in the break rooms. They conveniently forgot to CC her on vital SEC filings. They actively prayed for her downfall. Leading the charge was Ronald Harrington, a senior managing director, with a jawline carved from granite and an ego that required its own zip code. Ronald had been the golden boy of Hastings Capital, the heir apparent, until Sarah arrived and started dismantling his valuation models with terrifying precision. The Cold War between them finally went hot over a frozen wasteland. It was a Tuesday morning in November when Hastings summoned the executive team into the central boardroom. The skies over Manhattan were gray and weeping, freezing rain, but it was nothing compared to the climate of the asset currently projected on the massive digital display. Boreal extraction, Hastings announced, his voice slicing through the low murmur of the room. He tapped a laser pointer against the screen, illuminating a map of eastern Russia. A distressed mining and logistics conglomerate operating primarily out of Yakutia, Siberia. It is the coldest permanently inhabited region on Earth. Winter temperatures routinely drop below -70 degrees Fahrenheit. Ronald leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. It's a garbage asset, William. We hold a 20% stake from a legacy mezzanine debt conversion 3 years ago. The permafrost is destroying their heavy machinery. Steel literally shatters at those temperatures. Their operational costs to keep the drill sites heated are bleeding them dry. I say we cut our losses, write off the initial investment, and sell our equity to Elliott Management for pennies on the dollar before the company files for bankruptcy. Hastings looked at Ronald, then slowly turned his gaze to Sarah. Ms. Jenkins. You've been quiet. Do you agree with Ronald? Should we throw this frozen carcass to Elliott Management? Sarah looked at the prospectus on her tablet. She had been digging into boreal extraction for a week. No, she said softly. Ronald let out an exasperated sigh, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. Here we go. The waitress has a gut feeling. Sarah didn't even blink at the insult. She stood up, smoothing the skirt of her immaculate Tom Ford suit, a far cry from her thrift store days, and walked to the front of the room. She keyed a command into her tablet, replacing the map of Siberia with a dense, chaotic spreadsheet filled with Cyrillic text translated into English and daily localized temperature logs. "You're looking at the macro-level profit and loss statements, Ronald," Sarah said, her voice carrying the icy authority she had learned from Hastings. "And yes, on paper, they are failing. But you didn't look at the ground-level logistics. I pulled the daily operational reports from their primary base camp in Yakutia. They are signed by a 68-year-old local site manager named Martha." A grandmother in a parka, Ronald sneered. "Fascinating due diligence, Sarah." "Martha has survived in Yakutia her entire life," Sarah shot back, her eyes narrowing. "She knows the ice better than you know your own golf handicap. In her daily logs, she meticulously records equipment failure rates. 6 months ago, the failure rate of the diamond-tipped drill bits dropped by 90%. The fuel consumption for the localized heating units also plummeted." The room fell silent. Hastings leaned forward, his eyes locked on the data. If the equipment stopped breaking and fuel costs dropped, their profit margins should be skyrocketing, Peter, one of the junior VPs, pointed out, looking confused. "But they are still posting massive quarterly losses." "Exactly," Sarah said, tapping the screen. "Because they aren't drilling in Yakutia anymore." She pulled up a satellite imaging interface, overlaying thermal maps on top of Boreal Extraction's licensed land grids. Martha's logs show the main camp is practically a ghost town. They left just enough crew behind to keep the lights on and make it look operational to the satellite passes. But the thermal signatures show a massive convoy of heavy machinery moved 300 miles east, off their licensed diamond claims, and into an unregulated, mountainous region just outside the permafrost zone. "What are they drilling for?" Hastings asked, his voice deathly quiet. "I cross-referenced the new coordinates with old Soviet-era geological surveys," Sarah explained, her heart beating in a steady, aggressive rhythm. "It's not diamonds. It's a massive, untouched deposit of neodymium and praseodymium, rare earth metals, vital for electric vehicle batteries and military tech." Ronald scoffed loudly, but a bead of sweat suddenly appeared on his forehead. "That's speculative fiction, Sarah. You're reading tea leaves from a thermal map." "I'm reading the reality that Boreal's executive board is hiding," Sarah countered, stepping directly into Ronald's line of sight. "They discovered the rare earth vein, but they don't have the capital to mine it, and they know our debt covenants prevent them from taking on new loans. So they are intentionally tanking their own public valuation. They want to file for bankruptcy so they can restructure, wipe out our equity stake, and take the company private with a new backer." "And who is the new backer?" Hastings asked. Sarah looked directly at Ronald. "Elliott Management." Accusing a rival firm of corporate espionage was a dangerous game. Accusing a senior managing director of Hastings Capital of being the mole was a career death sentence if Sarah was wrong. "Watch your mouth, Jenkins," Ronald snarled, half standing from his mahogany chair. The polished veneer of the Wall Street patrician cracked, revealing a panicked animal underneath. "Are you implying I am involved in a conspiracy over a frozen dirt pile in Siberia?" "I'm not implying anything, Ronald. I'm stating a fact," Sarah said. Her voice remained steady, a perfect mirror of Hastings' cold authority. She pressed a button on her tablet, replacing the thermal map of Yakutia with a digital access log. 2 weeks ago, William asked me to run a forensic audit on our server traffic, Sarah explained to the silent room, her eyes locked on Ronald. Someone was downloading the raw, unencrypted geodata from the Boreal extraction servers, specifically the data regarding the eastern sector. Anyone with level 4 clearance can access that, Ronald fired back, his voice wavering. It proves nothing. It proves nothing on its own, Sarah agreed smoothly. But I cross-referenced the access timestamps with encrypted email packets leaving our network. Every time the Boreal geodata was downloaded, a massive file packet was sent to a proxy server in the Cayman Islands, a server belonging to a subsidiary of Elliott Management. The silence in the room was so profound that the hum of the HVAC system sounded like a jet engine. "And who downloaded the data, Sarah?" Hastings asked. He sat completely still, his hands resting flat on the table, looking like an executioner weighing his axe. "The access credentials belong to Ronald Harrington," Sarah said. "It's a lie!" Ronald shouted, slamming his fist down. He turned frantically to Hastings. "William, she faked the logs. She's a glorified waitress trying to frame me to cover her own lack of experience. She wants my desk." "Did you fabricate the logs, Sarah?" Hastings asked, mildly. "I didn't need to," Sarah replied. She tapped her screen one final time. An audio file began to play over the boardroom speakers. It was a recording of a phone call. "The old woman in the ice camp is getting suspicious," a thick Russian accent crackled through the static. "She is asking too many questions about where the fuel trucks are going. Fire her. Or lose her in the snow, I don't care." Ronald's voice echoed in the room, unmistakable and damning. "Just keep the thermal signatures low for another month. I'm pushing Hastings to sell the equity to Elliott next week. Once the paper is signed, the rare earth vein is ours." Ronald froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of grey. "How?" Ronald whispered, staring at the speakers in absolute horror. That was a burner phone. It was completely encrypted. "Martha," Sarah said simply. "The 68-year-old grandmother in a parka. She might not have a degree from Yale, Ronald, but she knows when a corporate suit from Moscow is lying to her." She tapped the satellite phone uplink at the base camp 3 months ago, when the fuel trucks started diverting. She buried the audio files in the daily operational logs, hoping someone at the parent company would actually read them. "I read them." Hastings stood up. He walked slowly around the massive table until he was standing directly behind Ronald's chair. "William, please," Ronald trembled. "Elliott offered me a partnership. We can fix this." "You tried to sell my property from under my feet," Hastings whispered, leaning down so his mouth was an inch from Ronald's ear. "You thought you were the smartest man in the room. But you were outsmarted by an elderly woman freezing in Yakutia and a waitress from Ohio." Hastings stood up straight and looked at the security guards by the doors. "Strip him of his phone and his laptop," Hastings ordered, his tone absolute zero. "Escort him out. Call our legal team. I want injunctions filed against Elliott Management by noon. We are triggering the fraud clauses, executing a hostile takeover, and seizing control of the entire rare earth deposit." As the guards hauled a sputtering Ronald out of the room, Hastings turned his gaze back to the remaining executives. They stared at Sarah with a mixture of profound awe and deep-seated terror. 10 minutes later, Sarah was back in her office. The adrenaline crash was brutal, making her hands shake as she poured a glass of water. She had won. The heavy door clicked open, and Hastings walked in without knocking. "Brilliant work, Sarah," he said, pouring himself a drink from her crystal decanter. "We'll make billions off that Yakutia site once we bring in our own heavy machinery." "What happens to Martha?" Sarah asked quietly. "The woman who gave us the audio. She saved the deal." Hastings paused, taking a sip. "She's a liability. Give her a standard severance package and terminate her contract. We need a clean slate." Sarah closed her eyes. The cold from the glass window seemed to seep straight into her bones. Hastings wasn't a hero. He was a machine that ate companies and discarded the human beings inside them. "Of course, William," Sarah said, her voice perfectly blank. "A clean slate." As Hastings left the office, Sarah opened a secure file on her personal tablet. She had saved Ronald's offshore account numbers. She wasn't going to let Martha freeze. Hastings thought he owned her, but he didn't realize he had just taught her exactly how to steal his empire. The winter in Yakutia doesn't forgive. It is a brutal, crushing force where the temperature plummets to -70 degrees, freezing engine oil into solid blocks and shattering unprotected steel like glass. For 68-year-old Martha, it was simply home. She sat inside her reinforced, heated modular cabin, nursing a mug of black tea, listening to the howling wind batter the metal walls of the Boreal extraction base camp. When the encrypted satellite phone on her desk buzzed, a device she had salvaged from a fired Moscow executive 3 years ago, she didn't expect the voice on the other end to belong to a 26-year-old woman in Manhattan. "Martha, my name is Sarah Jenkins. I work for William Hastings." The voice crackled through the static. Martha took a slow sip of her tea. "If you are calling to fire me, little bird, you are saving me from freezing to death. Tell your boss I want my severance in euros." "I'm not calling to fire you," Sarah replied, her voice crystal clear, despite the 10,000 miles of frozen wasteland between them. "I'm calling to make you a multimillionaire, but you have to trust me, and you have to move fast." Over the next 48 hours, while William Hastings was busy uncorking vintage champagne to celebrate his hostile takeover of the Boreal rare earth deposit, Sarah executed the most dangerous financial maneuver of her life. She didn't sleep. She used her newly minted $2 million salary advance and leveraged the offshore routing data she had stripped from Ronald Harrington's burned accounts. She didn't buy the mine. Hastings already owned the dirt. Instead, Sarah looked at the logistics. To extract neodymium from the Yakutian permafrost, you needed hyper-specialized, localized heating grids and a fleet of custom-built, ice-reinforced transport crawlers. Without them, the rare earth metals were trapped under a mile of impenetrable ice. Sarah formed a blind LLC in Delaware. Then, utilizing Martha's boots-on-the-ground connections with the local Yakutian transport unions, Sarah bought the sole operational logistics fleet in the region and secured the exclusive surface leasing rights to the only mountain pass capable of supporting heavy machinery out of the valley. She transferred 51% of the holding company's ownership directly to Martha. 3 weeks later, the snow began to fall in New York. Hastings called a mandatory executive meeting. He stood at the head of the boardroom, radiating absolute triumph. The hostile takeover was complete. The Boreal board had been gutted, and Hastings Capital now owned the largest untapped rare earth vein on the planet. "We break ground in 5 days," Hastings announced to the room, tapping the digital map of Siberia. "I want our own extraction crews flown in, and somebody confirmed that the old woman running the base camp has been formally evicted from the property." Sarah sat at the opposite end of the mahogany table. She slowly closed her laptop. The click echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Martha isn't going anywhere, William," Sarah said. Hastings paused, his smile fading into a look of dangerous confusion. "Excuse me? I gave a direct order to terminate her contract." "You did," Sarah acknowledged, standing up, and she accepted her severance. "But you have a massive problem. You own the rare earth vein, yes, But you don't own the heavy-duty transport crawlers, the specialized heating grids, or the surface rights to the only road leading out of the valley. Those assets were just purchased by an independent logistics firm called Apex Permafrost Holdings. Hastings' eyes narrowed into terrifying slits. Who owns Apex? Martha owns 51%, Sarah said, her voice steady, locking eyes with the billionaire predator. I own the other 49. The boardroom erupted into chaos, but Hastings remained perfectly, deathly still. He stared at Sarah, his mind rapidly calculating the trap she had just sprung. You used your advance, Hastings whispered, realizing the magnitude of the betrayal. You used my money to buy the toll booth to my gold mine. You taught me to look for the invisible leverage, William, Sarah replied smoothly. Without Martha's transport fleet and her road, your rare earth metals will sit under the ice until the end of time. She knows how to survive in Yakutia. You don't. Hastings took a slow, menacing step toward her. I will crush you in court, Sarah. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. On what grounds? Sarah shot back, unflinching. I didn't steal company funds. I didn't break a non-compete because Hastings Capital isn't in the logistics business. It was a perfectly legal, heavily obfuscated corporate maneuver. Sound familiar? If you sue me, the extraction is delayed for years, the investors panic, and your billion-dollar asset bleeds you dry. She slid a single piece of heavy stock paper across the table. Here are the new terms, Sarah said. Martha retains a 20% gross royalty on all materials transported out of the valley, ensuring she and her family never have to worry about the cold again. And you are making me a full, equal partner at Hastings Capital. Not an employee, a partner. Or I freeze you out. William Hastings looked at the contract. He looked at the brilliant, ruthless woman standing before him, the waitress he thought he had bought. Slowly, a dark, genuine laugh escaped his lips. He picked up his silver pen. Well played, partner, he murmured, and signed his name. The world of high finance is a ruthless game of chess, played by predators who believe they are untouchable. But as William Hastings learned, the most dangerous piece on the board isn't the king. It's the pawn that quietly makes its way to the other side to become a queen. Sarah Jenkins walked into the lion's den with nothing but a cheap apron and a brilliant mind, and she walked out owning half the Hunt empire. She didn't just survive the cutthroat environment of Wall Street, she mastered it, ensuring that the people at the bottom, like an elderly survivor braving the world's harshest winters, finally got their due. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of corporate warfare, revenge, and ultimate victory. If Sarah's brilliant chess moves kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic tale. Drop a comment below. Would you have had the nerve to face down a billionaire? See you in the next video.